right, we can go ahead and get started.
Great. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that you could return for our afternoon sessions, leading off with Jen Murray. I say a little introduction on tape that you'll get in just a moment, so I'll spare you another biography of Jen's career. But I do have some other quick announcements to remind everyone about our October event. If you're joining us for the first time, we are having a mini CWI conference focusing on North Carolina during the war. Friday night will be an opening lecture by Jetkin Browning of Appalachia State, who will talk about North Carolina, not just in the Army in Northern Virginia, but also the home front. And then Saturday will be devoted to tours, starting at McPherson's Woods or Herbst Woods, going over to Iverson's attack, and then discussing Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. That will be on Saturday. The Sunday morning, we will lead off with at the North Carolina Monument, and then from there, we'll walk Pettigrew's attack. And then we'll end around noon on Sunday. What is different this year is that there'll be no housing, of course, at Gettysburg College. These students will be occupying that. And as I said this morning, if you are at all interested, I would move quickly because it is very difficult to get hotels in Gettysburg in the fall. We already have some folks who've signed up, which of course, I think that's great. And we have a capacity of about 110, roughly, somewhere in that range. So yes, if you're interested, go to our website. You'll see some more details about it as well.
And Pete, can I just say one thing real quick before you move on? We did learn today that people have started calling some of the hotels that we've reserved room blocks at, and several of the hotels say that they have no record of our room block. Heather is going to be calling around to those hotels this coming week to, again, remind them that we do in fact have room blocks. We made contracts with them all back in March. So don't worry, there are room blocks that are there. Just keep calling. Heather will work it all out, as she always does. And
Ashley, I'm so glad that you, I'm glad you mentioned that. So Ashley, the hotels that we've had arrangements with or have arrangements with, that's all on the website and people can see that as well. Great. Thank you, Heather, for doing that, because I can back you on this. I remember when you did all that last spring. So again, yeah, we should get that all straightened out by early next week. Don't forget two other quick things. We have the code for UNC Press, which is offering a spectacular 40% off on all of their Civil War titles. So you want to check that out. And again, we would very much appreciate any support you might be able to provide. We put this conference on, and we did it because we wanted to make sure that people got their Civil War and got their Civil War Institute. And we're looking very much forward to seeing you all in person next year. But as you know, CWI does a lot more than just a conference. We do a number of programs for our students that are instrumental to promoting their professional career. So again, if you have the capacity and the desire, we would certainly appreciate it. And finally, and then I think Ashley has some announcements to make. CWI 2022, I've already mentioned some of the people who will be speaking: Gary Gallagher, Brooke Simpson, Joan Wall, Jeffrey Word, Carol Reardon, and our own Jennifer Murray. Jen and I, after our sessions last night, she bullied me into going into the Reliance Mons Saloon. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to go home and be a good father, but instead I went out on a night on the town in Gettysburg. The Reliance Mons Saloon, it is quite the place. And so we were talking and chatting about a variety of things. And it came to our attention that Jen Murray is probably the only person who has been as a speaker to every CWI since I've been here, and that's going on 11 years. And so many of you in our audience, you know Jen well, you know about her talks, about her battlefield tours. If you've not been on one, it's a real treat. You'll see it in just a moment. And next year, Jen relented. I had to pressure and beg to be her co-tour leader. We're going to do the 18th Virginia next year when we do From Battlefield to Field Hospital. So we were talking about that last night. So it's always fun to work with Jen, and you'll get again to see her in action in just a moment. Ashley, though, has a few other quick announcements, I believe.
Yes, so just a reminder for anybody who is not signed in, when Pete was making the announcement about the lodging, that we have booked our room blocks for our October event. We do have a number of room blocks booked at several local hotels. All of those can be found on our webpage for the fall event. I've posted the link in the chat box for you for the event. We have gotten, I guess, several people who've now reported that they've tried to sign up for a room at some of these hotels that we have room blocks at. And there's been some confusion where the hotels weren't aware, they said, of the room block. We do in fact have room blocks. Heather is going to be calling around to those hotels this coming week to get it figured out. But rest assured that we do have blocks at several different hotels. And if you just keep calling later in the week, I'm sure that you will be able to get one of those blocks after magic.
We should note, Ashley, that Heather is such a team player that I distinctly remember her saying that if our attendees cannot find a hotel, she'll open up her house. That's the kind of, look at that, how excited she is. And you'll probably even do breakfast, right, as well. It'll be a bed and breakfast.
She might have to kick the goats out of their shed and let
goats
people sleep in there.
Yes.
But
yeah, Heather Miller is a goat herder. So yeah, you would have to contend with the goats, but there we have it. There is the kind of commitment that we get from the CWI staff. Thank you so much, Heather. All right.
The other thing I just wanted to say real quick, sorry, Pete, is that there have been some questions about whether the programming is going to be available after these sessions run. We are recording every single session from this whole weekend, including last night, today's sessions, and tomorrow. Everything is going to go up on YouTube sometime this week for the CWI's YouTube. So if you missed something, or if you want to watch it again, or you have a friend who wants to see it, it will be available this coming week on the CWI YouTube channel. Every single session that we have been doing so far, and the ones from tomorrow as well.
I just want to say I'm very grateful to PCN. They've done always wonderful things for promoting our work, as has C-SPAN. And I know many of the people in our audience, that's where they have seen us. But I want to just reiterate, and I think we all would agree, boy, nothing beats being in person, being live, that face-to-face interaction. So it's going to be great to see Jen here in just a moment, but it'll be even better next year. To watch us in action, I suspect I'll be carrying her maps and all of her things and following her around. That's what will happen, I suspect. All right. Is there anything else, Ashley, before we hit the play button?
Since you mentioned PCN, I think we should also make sure that we give them an extra special shout out. We went out and pre-recorded these battlefield segments last week. We had a beautiful day to do it. It was great. We brought out our own CWI filming equipment, and I'm not sure exactly what happened. Some of the segments had great sound. Some of them had intermittent sound, and one of them, including the final stop at the field hospital, had no sound. Luckily, PCN was with us that day, and they very graciously responded to my very panicked after hours call to ask for their footage. So you're going to see the footage of Jen doing her tour, and also my tour bits afterwards this afternoon with the big PCN logo on it. And the reason for that is, of course, because they own that footage. And thank goodness they do. And they were there, and they were so kind to give us all of their footage. I told Jen, I just blamed it on the ghosts. Apparently Barksdale was not happy with us that day. So there we go. All right. So Pete, anything else? Are we ready to go?
We're ready to roll.
All right. So I'm going to get my screen share up.
Actually, I should though ask, so we're going to go through every one of the stops, and then after, at the conclusion, then we'll have the question and answer period.
Yes. So there are 4 stops that Jen and Pete did together. And then after that, Jen will be here to do a live Q&A. And as always, you guys can type in your questions and comments into the chat box. I'm the only one who can see them as the host, so I'll be fielding them out to Jen afterward.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a lovely lunch and that you enjoyed the interview with Kent Masterson Brown. If you are joining us for the first time, I'm Pete Carmichael, the director of the Civil War Institute. Of course, we would much rather be live and that you would be following Jen Murray across the battlefield. Many of you have been on one of Jen Murray's tours. They're always outstanding. Though, there's behind the scenes stuff that they're not aware of because it's behind the scenes. And I just want you to know that Jen is very ambitious with her tours in the planning process. She wanted to take one of our groups, ready? From the Cadore farmhouse, which you can almost see off in the distance there, most of you know where it's located, following the footsteps of the Iron Brigade on July the 1st, all the way to the McPherson's Woods. And look at her, she's shaking her head as if I was weak and soft, and I nixed that because, of course, I wanted many of you to come back the next year, and Jen didn't quite appreciate that. But what Jen always does is she gives first-rate tours because she was in the National Park Service, like Ashley. And when you get someone from the National Park Service, you get people who know about the ground and the importance of it. But before I turn it over to Jen, I want to remind everyone, as you know, if you feel in the spirit of giving, we would really appreciate a donation to the Civil War Institute. We do a number of initiatives that promote the scholarship and also the educational experiences of our students. This year, we have more than 30 students working at various historical sites, most of them Civil War, most of them National Park Service. And to give those students those opportunities, we have to fund it. And so we certainly appreciate that you're here today and enjoying our programming. And if you find it in your heart, give us a donation. That would be fantastic. So we have Jen with us today. As you can see, she's decked out in Auburn, which would lead me to believe that you once attended Auburn. And you did. You got your PhD there under Ken No, who just retired. Yeah. And a little bit, can we get you some more bio here? Because you're ready to go, aren't you, with your microphone?
I'm double mic.
I'm going to give you a question. It is Jen's birthday yesterday. So happy birthday.
Thank you, Pete.
Did you get yourself a big birthday cake?
We did.
Yeah?
Had a big birthday cake, and I spent the day
And what was on your
preparing-
birthday wish list? It had to be Civil War books.
Civil War books. Yeah, of course.
So
right?
you got your wish list.
I got my new Meade biography, Civil
From
War.
Kim Masterson
Kim
Brown?
Masterson
Excellent.
Brown
All right.
Meade book. Yeah.
How about the War for the Common Soldier?
I have that
You
one.
already
I
have
already
that.
had that
Okay.
one,
All right.
but you can never have too many copies of
Pete's
War for the
books.
Common
That's
Soldier.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, well, Jen, again, happy birthday. And today, Jen is going to lead us in the wake of William Barksdale's assault on July 2nd, of course. We are standing right on the edge of Seminary Ridge. And Jen here in a moment is going to give us the dispositions of the brigade, give us a little bit of background about Barksdale as well. We have 3 stops on the battlefield, and then we're going to finish at Gabor Bord's house. Gabor Bord lives on a historic site, and the barn that was the field hospital for Barksdale's brigade is still standing. And so we're going to end our tour there. So, Jen, why don't you go ahead and get us started and give us a sense of where we're standing right now, and maybe even a little bit of background on July the 2nd that helps us contextualize Barksdale's assault.
Okay. Thanks, Pete, and thank you, CWI, for joining us on the Barksdale assault. So we're standing right in the heart of Seminary Ridge. The direction that the cameras are all pointing to now is toward the Union line, where 90,000 federal soldiers under George Meade's command in the Army of the Potomac will be positioned and will be ready to take this attack on July the 2nd. But we're focusing on Barksdale.
That's right.
And just about 1,500 Mississippians, and they are going to be positioned here, essentially right in the heartland where we're standing for the attack on July the 2nd. And I think if we can do this, we could pan, and I could sort of outline for our listeners how the Mississippi Brigade is laid out.
Sure.
We are standing right in front of the Mississippi Monument, which would be Barksdale's left flank on July the 2nd. That monument, of course, goes up in the 1970s. So that would be his left flank. Now, Barksdale's brigade covers a front that's about 350 yards. So from the Mississippi Monument then south would be the heart of Barksdale's command, and his right flank regiment, which is the 21st Mississippi, would be positioned right about where the Longstreet observation tower is at today. So the 21st Mississippi is the far right regiment. To their left is the 17th Mississippi, right near where the Warfield House is at today that you can see in your view. The Park Service restored that recently. Then to their left is the 13th Mississippi, and then the final regiment is the 18th Mississippi. And all told, Barksdale has about 1,400 men in his command, and they will be stepping off here at about 5:30 in the afternoon to assault the peach orchard, the pivotal terrain on July the 2nd.
So Jen, just very quickly, can help those at home see the outlines of the peach orchard directly in front of us. What are we thinking about in terms of distance from where we're standing now to the Union line?
Yeah, we're about a mile, under a mile even, right, to the peach orchard. And you can see the heart of the Union line off in the front. We can probably, if you want to trace that real quickly, pick out the round tops off to my left front. Big round top is the one that's covered in the trees. It was like that at the time of the battle. Then off to the left in front, you can see Little Round Top with a bare knoll, which it was like at the time of the battle. You can probably zoom in and see the Castle Monument, which is the 44th New York. That would be the left flank of the Union Army's battle line. And then following the line further left or north, you can see the peach orchard in our distant front with a collection of monuments with the granite bronze tablets on it. And that will be the salient, and we'll dive into that as we move on. But if we keep tracing the federal line left up really the Emmitsburg Road, which is the position Sickles' men will occupy, you can see the Joseph Sherfy farm in our front, the red barn, and then off to the left you can see the house with the green shutters. That's going to be important on July the 2nd. That will be where the 114th Pennsylvania is positioned. And then further left, the next barn you see is the Klingel property, right on the Emmitsburg Road. And then further left, and we might get a little bit of obscuring from that lone tree, is the Kadori farm, which would be really the right flank of Sickles' line when he moves his 3rd Corps forward. And then if you keep looking even further left, you can trace up to Cemetery Hill and see the blue observation tower that sits right along the Baltimore Pike. Cemetery Hill is where the Union line in the shape of the fishhook would bend, and then it runs east to Culp's Hill, which would be the right flank held by the 12th Corps of Meade's line. But what's important for Barksdale is the ground right in front of us. That's where the Mississippians will focus their assault and ultimately capture that ground on the afternoon of July the 2nd.
So real quickly, give us some context about in terms of Confederate High Command. A lot of frustration. We're all aware of that. Aware of the disagreement between Longstreet and Lee, and we don't need to, of course, go over that controversy, but there was a degree of surprise when Longstreet was told that the Federals occupied the peach orchard, right? He was expecting that the Union left flank would be open. Of course, he was quickly convinced of the fact that there was artillery here. So I'd like for you then to help us understand what happened here in terms of artillery within the scheme of Longstreet's entire attack, right?
Right, well, the whole plan for the July the 2nd is going to get a big wrinkle in it when Sickles and the 3rd Corps move forward, the unauthorized movement. What the Confederates are planning is an en echelon attack that basically rolls up the federal line north along the Emmitsburg Road.
Right. That's ultimate, but that's the adjustment that they initially make. What they expect to find is nothing in front of them, right?
That's correct.
There's something here. McLaws sends word back to Longstreet. Longstreet is infuriated by this and doesn't believe that the McLaws is correct. So he rides up roughly to where that intersection is. Most of the people who are watching this know exactly what I'm speaking of, the intersection that's close to the tower here. And of course, he sees these guns and that federal presence. And then you're right, this is attack in echelon. And I'm just curious your thoughts about this. I won't name the historian, but the historian a very noted one of Gettysburg, said to me that this en echelon attack really wasn't Longstreet's plan. That in taking Hood's men, and we can talk about the divisions if we need to, but the far right of Longstreet, the assault that's going to sweep ultimately across Devil's Den and up to Little Round Top, that attack began really before McLaws' men get well into position. Would you agree with that point?
Right.
And so this person makes a pretty interesting argument that it wasn't then the intent that the assaults that followed were an echelon. It just sort of happened that way. And that is an interesting idea, because in reading Edward Porter Alexander's Fighting for the Confederacy, Alexander pointed out that prior to the infantry assault, somewhere in this immediate area, that the officers under McLaws were coming together and trying to figure out how to strike this line, and doing so really without any communication with Hood, right? That they are, both of these divisions are, in a sense, acting almost in isolation. That's a theory. I'm not saying that that's correct. I don't know what your thoughts are about
Well,
that
the assault on July the 2nd is incredibly complicated. And Hood's guys are positioned even further south off of the Confederate line, down along Warfield Ridge, and they step off at about 4 o'clock. And they will be the first to attack the Little Round Top.
What time does Barksdale step off?
Barksdale steps off around 5:30.
So there you go.
And he's really impatient because he's seeing the units to his south or his right starting to step off. And Barksdale will approach Longstreet asking
to move. Interesting though, after the war, Joseph Kershaw, the South Carolinians who were to the right, immediate right of Barksdale's brigade, Kershaw, after the war, complained that Barksdale did not keep pace with his brigade, and in fact said that if they had hit the Union line in unison, that the results would have been much more decisive.
Wow.
That's a Kershaw criticism, but that's after the fact, of course.
Sure. Well, the trouble with the en echelon attack is you throw your units in, you stagger them. I would always describe it when I worked here as like a tidal wave. And you hit the Union line at different points, and it makes it incredibly difficult for Sickles to reinforce his line. And that's exactly what happens. And when we get to the Peach Orchard, the next stop, we'll see what the problem is with that terrain and having that kind of salient in your line.
Yes, and when we get to the next stop too, Jen, I hope you comment on the assumptions we make about frontal attacks, the assumptions we make about fighting that happens at the brigade level, because as we look across this field here, this is a classic frontal assault, right? The kind of thing that we often sit back and we condemn Civil War officers for committing. So when we get up there, I hope we'll be able to chat about that issue as well.
Can we show them Barksdale real quick?
Let's show them Barksdale. Let's do it. And then when we get up there, then you can tell them a little bit about Billy Barksdale.
If you can you zoom in and see Barksdale? People that have been on my tours before always know I bring a lot of photos. So this is the guy that we're talking about, and we can hold on to his bio for the next stop if you'd like, Pete. But this will give you someone to picture as we're talking about this afternoon in the fight on July 2nd, 1863.
All right, great. Thanks, Jim. Okay. See you at the next stop. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are at tour stop 2. We are in the middle of the Peach Orchard, again with Jen Murray. One thing I didn't say about Jen at the previous stop is where she's teaching, not at Auburn. Where's your Oklahoma State gear? That's where she's teaching now. Do you not have any?
That's true. I'll debut it for something else. With
for CWI. Something else?
Right. All your CWI people know that I wear my Auburn stuff all the time.
We got to get you some Gettysburg CWI swag.
Let's do it.
Okay, absolutely.
For the next one.
We won't pay you an honorarium, it'll just be all swag.
Sure.
Good.
Okay,
got it.
Great.
Excellent.
Sounds
now,
perfect.
the other thing we need to say, Jen, is that Jen is mentioned Kim Masterson Brown's book on Meade. Jen is working on a full-scale biography of the general, and as one of your editors at UNC Press, I'm curious, how is that manuscript coming along?
I have 10 chapters of the Meade book done.
Nice. Yeah, how many more chapters to go?
Maybe 5 or 6.
Ooh, that's a big book.
Yeah, it's a big book.
That's a big book.
It's 368 pages right now.
So far.
So far.
We're excited.
Big story to tell.
It is a big story to tell. We're excited to see that, Jen. So why don't you get us situated here? And I think the best thing to do, if you don't mind me suggesting, is if you look off to the left, we're looking towards Seminary Ridge, and maybe you could help the folks at home situate them as to where we were at our first stop.
Right, so as the cameras are panning, you can see Seminary Ridge, the heart of the Confederate line, and that's where we just left you at. If you would look off into the distance to the dense tree line, that's where Barksdale and 1,400 Mississippians will step off somewhere near 5:30 in the afternoon. There are Confederates stepping off at various points, as Pete and I mentioned at the last talk, this en echelon attack. So if you can imagine Seminary Ridge kind of being a blaze, like a wave or a phase step-like attack, the whole entirety of the Confederate line with artillery starting to fire. I think E.P. Alexander says he puts in about 50 guns.
Total. He does.
That will fire onto the Union position to soften it in advance of the Confederate assault.
And I'll just quickly add that the book I mentioned before, Fighting for the Confederacy, Edward Porter Alexander's personal memoirs, as many of our people in the audience know, that he also published a memoir that he intended for the public to read, but this was done while he was stationed in Nicaragua. He wrote it for his family's consumption only. It's edited and published by University of North Carolina Press. Gary Gallagher was the editor of it. In that memoir, it's fantastic. He compares this place to artillery hell, what Stephen Lee called the fighting near the Dunker Church at the Battle of Antietam. Now, Alexander was not there, but if you go to Fighting for the Confederacy, he makes a very quick comparison in terms of casualties, and it was far more severe here again. And if our cameras quickly pan back and looking at Seminary Ridge, I think, Jen, we're talking maybe 800 yards or so between the artillery, Confederate artillery, and where we're standing right now. That's one reason why the destruction and damage was so great. The other thing, again, is I take in that field, and I can't think of many other places, at least in the Eastern Theater, where the attack zone is not terribly long. It's still out in the open. That's, I think, one reason why Barksdale has some success here. But you're going to help us understand why Barksdale was able to crack this line. I think you're going to begin by telling us about where we're standing right now before we get to the actual assault itself.
Right, so we're standing in the peach orchard, and what we see today in 2021 is just a small portion of what the orchard was like at the time of the battle. It was multi-acre, and it extended on the north side of the Wheatfield Road. This is Joseph Sherfy's peach orchard, and we'll get into the problems, I think, with the line here in just a minute. But can you turn around and show the viewers back home kind of how far or disconnected we are from the bulk of the Union line? You can't talk about Barksdale's assault or really any of the fighting on July the 2nd without acknowledging Dan Sickles and the forward movement of the 3rd Corps. So the direction that you all are looking now is towards the Union line, and you're all Gettysburg experts, so we don't need a lot of detail on Dan Sickles and the forward movement, except to say that he starts moving his 3rd Corps at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Sickles is supposed to hold everything on the southern end of the line, which would be from the Pennsylvania Memorial, the big white dome monument you can see behind you with the angel figure on top, off to the right, which is south. And by about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he's completed his forward movement. So Sickles brings the 3rd Corps out here in advance. They're disconnected from the bulk of the Union line by about 3/4 of a mile. And he's set up his new line in the shape of a big lazy V. Looks like the camera's pointing towards the Kadori House. We mentioned that earlier. That would be about where his right flank of the 3rd Corps would be, with Union troops then paralleling the Emmitsburg Road down through the Sherfy property that we showed you at our last stop. But then here at the peach orchard, the Union line makes a salient. And we can talk, Pete, about the weaknesses of that. A 90-degree angle.
Yeah, so tell us, help us sort of visualize what's the salient. So the Federals are facing as I'm facing, yes?
Well,
looking due west, yes?
Yeah, the cool thing when you're out on the battlefield is the monuments and the artillery help tell us a story.
Yes.
So if you see the, I'm sorry, I'm having you go in all directions with the camera.
She's getting dizzy.
If you see the artillery position right off behind us, these Federal guns are facing south. But then on the Emmitsburg Road, on the other side of the peach orchard, you can see artillery guns facing west. And it really gives us an idea of how precarious the Union position is in the peach orchard. It forms a salient, or a 90-degree angle. It's like the Bulge at the Battle of the Bulge for my World War II fans.
What about the Bulge at Spotsylvania? Let's keep it Civil War here, right?
Sorry, no, yes.
No, let's focus. We're narrow here at
Civil War.
CWI. It's
Yes.
just Civil War and nothing else.
Nothing else, I agree. Okay.
So that's a similar, same salient.
It's the same thing.
Much larger and bigger.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it allows you to be attacked from two sides, and that's precisely what happens
That's what
here.
happens here as well. One quick thing, could you help me understand this? Lots of cannon here, right? And it seems like there's more cannon and more monuments to batteries than to infantry.
Yes.
So what's the deal?
So I'm glad you asked that. That was a great question.
Thank you.
The Confederate attack starts at about 4 o'clock, as we mentioned, and the Peach Orchard get hit, 90 minutes or so later. So Sickles' line is so long that he's sending reinforcements from other parts of his line at 4:30, Devil's Den, Wheatfield, and such, that by the time Barksdale hits the Peach Orchard, this line is devoid of the infantry that you need to hold it. So what makes this position even more precarious is that the infantry line isn't strong enough. So Freeman McGilvery will be plugging artillery into this position. And some of the greatest stories in the fight on July the 2nd here in the Peach Orchard involve artillery. Someone like Captain John Bigelow, and I think we might get to talk about him at our next stop. But the artillery is going to be particularly vulnerable. And what will happen when we set up the brigade at our last stop, I mentioned the 21st Mississippi. That's the right regiment of Barksdale's command. So when the brigade advances across the field that we've shown you a few times, they get to the Emmitsburg Road and they split. 3 of the regiments wheel up the Emmitsburg Road, picking off, these are men of David Bell Birney's division, while 1 regiment, the isolated 21st Mississippi, steamrolls down the Wheatfield Road and goes right for those vulnerable artillery guns. And they will have great success in capturing not only the ground, but also some of those artillery pieces until they're recaptured by Union soldiers.
So I want to end with a final question, very open-ended question, and that is this idea that frontal attacks in the Civil War underscores the lack of imagination that Civil War officers failed to show, right, from time to time on the battlefield. How does this attack, which enjoys remarkable success, how do you explain this? And what does this say about some of our common assumptions, generalizations that we make about Civil War tactics?
A couple of thoughts on that. Any of your CWI attendees have stood in the Peach Orchard, and I'm sure many of them have. This is good ground, and it's particularly good for artillery. And that's the reason that Sickles wanted it in the first place, maybe because of what happened at Chancellorsville. This is a good artillery platform. It gives you commanding fields of fire. So it tells us about key terrain and what makes key terrain good, or some disadvantages. But the whole entirety of his line with the salient is completely problematic. And if I can say something nice about George Meade here for a minute, if you think about the fight on July the 2nd, Sickles' forward movement creates tremendous havoc for the Army of the Potomac. And Meade will have to pull no fewer than 5 divisions from other parts of his Fishhook line to reinforce Sickles' blunder to the tune of about 20,000 men. So he's really patchworking the Union line. Does the assault here work? Sure. I don't want to give away the ending, but the Confederates, the Mississippians, do capture the Peach Orchard, but it's at great cost, as we'll continue to share with you along the way.
Absolutely. So at the next stop, I think I have a map that will illustrate how Barksdale's brigade, in a sense, broke into, or at least one regiment by itself. And so we can look at that at the next stop. Okay.
Yep,
that sounds great. Thanks. All right, we are at our final stop on the battlefield as we talk about Barksdale's assault, and we'll turn it over to Jen here, who will describe the attack. And then I just want to note that we also have another stop after this when we talk about the Crawford Farm and the field hospital, which is now currently where Gabor Bort resides. So we'll go ahead and start with the brigade assault and continue that.
Right, I think we're gonna just give a quick bio on Barksdale.
Yes, right.
If that's okay.
No, that's what we should do.
I showed you the photo of him before. Hopefully you got to see him at the first stop. Barksdale is one of the kind of iconic, irascible sort of personalities at Gettysburg. He's 41 years old at the time of the battle. He's born in Tennessee. He's a pre-war lawyer. He's in the Mexican-American War. He doesn't see any significant combat, but after the Mexican-American War, he serves in politics and quickly becomes one of the most controversial sort of proponents for secession as the secession crisis is heating up. When the war breaks out, Mississippi, of course, secedes from the Union in January of 1861. He will lead the 13th Mississippi as their colonel, and then he rises through the ranks, as we talked about, to become the brigade commander, position he takes after the Peninsula Campaign. And he will lead his brigade then into all the action prior to Gettysburg, including Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. So 41 years old, leading the men as we set up. And this is the exact round that they are coming across on July the 2nd that you're looking at behind Pete and I. So,
would you like to reference the map? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, maybe we could sort of get reoriented. If you're familiar with the park, we're standing on the back side of the Klingel farm. So the peach orchard is over to our left, and we are on Pete's map. We're sort of following the 21st Mississippi a little bit, which is here to the right. You can see Plum Run, and then I mentioned about how Barksdale's brigade splits with the other 3 regiments really moving over the ground behind Pete and I, which had been abandoned or vacant really by the 3rd Corps and Sickles' forward movement. So this is Barksdale's line. That en echelon attack will continue. Other Confederate units you see on the map, like Wilcox and Lang, also will step off after 5:30, attacking Humphreys, the other division of the 3rd Corps, and their position along the Emmitsburg Road. So really, Pete, we're standing right in the heart of Barksdale and the Mississippians' assault on July the 2nd.
So could you just help us as we look to our left, to the camera woman's right, the ridgeline in front of us follows what we call today the Wheatfield Road. Would it be accurate to suggest that one would visualize the 21st Mississippi, the far right regiment, the regiment that Barksdale's with, imagine it sweeping down parallel to that ridge line as it goes into the low ground off to our left, right? Would you agree with that, Jen?
Right.
Roughly?
Right.
Yes?
The 21st Mississippi is actually, Ashley, can you see the Gettysburg battlefield tour bus right now?
Yeah.
You can see the top of the double-decker bus.
Right.
That's the 21st Mississippi moving along, maybe then veering a little bit more towards us,
Right.
towards the Trossel Farm. The Trossel Farm is where Dan Sickles has his headquarters on July the 3rd, and we can see the barn right in our front. So if you can visualize that lone regiment kind of moving down the ridge line like Pete described, we caught a glimpse with that bus, giving us a good visual, but then heading right towards the Trossel Farm, where the artillery for the 3rd Corps has to make a very desperate stand.
So the remainder of Barksdale's brigade, we would, from our perspective, we're looking at the very center of the brigade, roughly, in this field directly in front of us, correct?
Yep.
And that brigade is going toward that thin wood line. So what's that thin wood line that we're seeing?
So the thin wood line right behind us is Plum Run. And that will be where the 21st Mississippi will sort of hit their high tide. If you can imagine this area here, and this is the problem with the Peach Orchard salient, I would describe it when I gave tours here to think of setting up a row of dominoes. And once those first Union regiments fall, like the 114th over at the Sherfy property, the rest of the line of dominoes fall. And very quickly by 6 o'clock, the Peach Orchard is ablaze. And the Union regiments, unable, whether they're infantry or artillery, to hold their ground facing west and south from two front, are being steamrolled. A very, very violent fight here at the Peach Orchard.
So this part of the line is in chaos, and it's in part because of Barksdale's immediate success here. And as we can look into this open ground here, would you describe what again would be the Union left flank or left center? It's now in crisis, right? So we've had crises at different points along from the far left, beginning with the Little Round Top Devil Den area. And now we have another crisis in which Meade is having to do, and I'll let you, of course, talk about your boy here. What's Meade do to stem this tide of Confederate assaults? And of course, Barksdale leading the way.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to use one of the words from a soldier who fought here. One of the Union soldiers fighting here, he's in Humphreys' division, talks about the line retreating and collapsing. And he says, soldiers were blinded with blood from ghastly head wounds. They streamed from the orchard, that's the Peach Orchard, the lane, the road, and the wheat field towards the low swale in Sickles' line, right back behind Plum Run. Next sentence, he says, riderless horses quivering with fright, plunged madly over the dead and the dying that dotted the field from the battle's front to Cemetery Ridge. So he's talking about this area the whole way back, and I think, Ashley, you're right on filming it. If you look behind the tree line that marks Plum Run, that open ground area where you can see the New York Auxiliary Monument, the gray one that looks like an open book, is where Sickles' Third Corps was to have been. And that's where the Union soldiers are falling back to. So just imagine the chaos and the Mississippians driving them further back to Cemetery Ridge.
This is the kind of question that I usually don't like to hear, but I'm going to ask it. And that is, it's hard to imagine another Confederate brigade in the Army of Northern Virginia, certainly on July 2nd, who achieved more than Barksdale's brigade. Who achieved more. I mean, it's pretty remarkable what they've done, just one brigade. Would you agree with that? Or would you say, as I would probably say as a response, you can't really make that kind of judgment, but Barksdale's brigade achieves quite a bit here. Do you?
Well, Barksdale's brigade achieves quite a bit at a high cost.
Right.
They do capture the peach orchard, and they will hold that key ground through the remainder of the battle, through July the 3rd. Right. But their casualty rate is incredible. Right. Barksdale himself, and we'll talk more about this at our next stop too, Barksdale is going to be mortally wounded down along Plum Run. He's pushing with the 21st Mississippi, and his entire brigade sustains 46% casualties. So 1,596 men step off, 105 of them are killed, 550 are wounded, and 92 are missing. So that's 747 casualties, 46%. That's incredibly high. Right. 21st Mississippi, they sustain over 50% casualties.
Right. Absolutely, high cost, but they actually gain and achieve something as a consequence, right? I mean, I don't know, I think it still is pretty phenomenal, and it gives us pause to think about what brigades could accomplish in a frontal attack, such as the one that Barksdale delivered. It says something about Barksdale, I suspect, as a brigade commander. It says a hell of a lot about the esprit de corps within that brigade. I mean, there's so much in this one action that tells us a great deal about the nature of the Army of Northern Virginia. And
sure.
the ridiculous notion that Lee had too much faith and too much confidence in his men, it just doesn't make any damn sense to me. I mean, July 2nd in particular demonstrates that his confidence and faith was absolutely well placed as well. I just real quickly, Jen, you might have a final comment. When we think about the peach orchard, we think almost exclusively of the fighting on July the 2nd, but we should remind folks that on the morning of July the 3rd, when Lee expected Longstreet to renew the assault on the Union left flank, and when that did not happen, that it is Lee and Longstreet and A.P. Hill and Heath, and maybe Wofford was up here as well, but they're at the peach orchard. And for those of you who come back to Gettysburg, I encourage you to stand there, forget about July the 2nd, and look down almost the spine of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, and it is there that the plan for the final attack was, I would say, was hatched there. And it gives you a perspective that will help you appreciate that the decision that was made was not a reckless gamble, but it was a calculated decision. Not saying it's the best decision, but it was calculated. And it did exactly what Lee always believed in. He believed in it from his days in the Mexican War, and that's spade work, right? You get on the field and you see what's there. That's exactly what Lee did at the peach orchard on July the 3rd. So we're gonna go from here to the Crawford farm, and we'll talk about Barksdale's mortal wounding and about the men here who were carted off as a crow flies. How far do you think it is from here to the Crawford farm?
2.5, 3 miles west.
We should be given some credit here. This spot was, who found this spot for us? Who decided this?
Yesterday we were doing reconnaissance, and my husband, Michael Walker, said, you want to come out here and talk about the final action. Look at this vista. So hopefully you all agree this is a worthy spot.
This was a good spot. And thank you to Michael.
You did a good job.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. We'll see you at the next stop at the Crawford farm. All right, we are at the John Crawford farm, and as promised, this was the site of the field hospital for Barksdale's brigade, and probably some Georgians from Sims's brigade made it here. We are roughly, what did we decide, 2.5 miles or so? 2.5 miles due west from the front where Barksdale's brigade was engaged. Obviously, we are far enough behind the lines that any of the wounded who were brought to this location, they were no longer in danger of being hit by Union shells. If we had had the time and you were doing the tour, if Jen was doing the tour, we would have walked all the way from Cemetery Ridge to this very spot. That's what you would have called for.
Next year,
right?
yeah.
Maybe next year we can do that. But we should have pointed out that during the attack itself, that there were probably aid stations, that's what we would call them, that were closer to the lines. I think we call it even a triage station as well, right? And that those color bearers, I'm not saying, stretcher bearers, they took those wounded probably to a pool of wagons or ambulances that would have been behind, I assume, Seminary Ridge, again, sheltered from the firing, then placed on those wagons and then brought to this location. It is hard to imagine that there were very many walking wounded at this site. One other thing to note about this site, it is on a beautiful location right along Marsh Creek, and of course having water near a field hospital is extremely important. So I would turn over to Jen to talk a little bit about this place and to begin by talking about William Barksdale and his mortal wounding.
Yeah, so when we left our group last time, we showed them the area of Plum Run near where Barksdale was wounded. And of course, he advances on horseback, and he will be shot as the assault is coming to its final moments, if you will. And Barksdale's shot twice. The wound that will prove fatal is the one that hits him in his left lung. And there are various accounts from different Union soldiers who recall either seeing him get wounded or claim to be responsible for carrying him off the field. There's some Vermont soldiers, particularly, and Pennsylvanians who give us pretty rich accounts. Barksdale is going to be taken off the field near Plum Run, and he will be treated and ultimately perish at the Hummelball House. So if your CWI listeners can imagine the Hummelball House, situate yourself on the Taneytown Road, heading south, so the National Cemetery is on your left, drive down the Taneytown Road, and the Hummelball property sits on the right, sort of behind the Pennsylvania Monument, and that's where Barksdale will be treated. But if you don't mind, we have some really great accounts from the soldiers who really share Barksdale's final moments with him that I'd like to share with our group. One of the soldiers who will be with Barksdale when he dies is with the 148th Pennsylvania, and his name is Robert Cassidy. And he's a musician, he's a drummer actually, and Cassidy will write to Barksdale's wife, whose name is Narcissa Barksdale's, after the war, and this is what he shares with Narcissa. He says, "I came upon the general accidentally. Kneeling at his side, I asked him if he desired any assistance. He informed me that he was very thirsty, and I endeavored to give him water from a canteen, but he was unable to take it in consequence of his recumbent position and pain from the wounds." So the soldier then, Cassidy, takes a spoon from his haversack and he writes, "I filled it several times and the general drank the water avidly." He continues to say to Narcissa, "The lung was cut, and every inhalation the blood was forced copiously with a sputtering noise from the wound. Noticing that his strength was failing rapidly, I continued to administer the water, dissolved morphine, and diluted liquor alternately until I saw he was on the edge of the dark river." There's other great accounts that talk about Barksdale, sort of irascible and temperamental to the end. He's barking out that he wants cold water. Cold water, I want cold water. And apparently says to the very end that he does not recant secession and hopes that Ewell will be, quote, thundering in the rear tomorrow, and that the Confederates will win the Battle of Gettysburg. Barksdale, of course, will perish on July the 3rd. He will be buried in the Hummelball property, and his body will be exhumed. Family members from Mississippi will come up a few years after the Civil War. They will exhume Barksdale's remains and take him back to Jackson, Mississippi, where he's buried in January.
Same cemetery, if you like Eudora Welty. If you like Eudora Welty, you're smiling at me that you don't like Eudora Welty. Her fiction's fantastic.
Okay.
Okay, don't take my word for that. they're in the same cemetery.
Okay, yeah. Fantastic, yeah.
That's kind of a conversation killer, I see. No. Okay, so we have Barksdale, he's killed, right?
Yes.
Mortally wounded. So now we're here at this building. Could you tell us then about the Jackson farm here?
Right, so we're at the John Crawford farm, whom you mentioned we're on Marsh Creek. And this property was a tenant farm by Basil Biggs during the Civil War. Basil Biggs was a pre-war black African-American tenant farmer who was also a veterinarian. And he will flee when the Confederate Army moves into Pennsylvania. Of course, the Confederates are confiscating black people, slaves are free along the way, and he will flee. And his farm then is used as a hospital, as Pete mentioned. John Crawford, though, is the other sort of human interest story to this property, too. If you read the 1860 census, he's the 13th wealthiest person in Gettysburg in 1860. He lives in town, and then Basil Biggs is the tenant farmer here.
So could you give us a sense or a feel for what you think this building, we're standing in the original barn. It's an unusual barn in that it is both 18th century and 19th century. I don't know if our cameras can get this, but directly in front of us is the 18th century section of the barn, and it is, again, I've not seen anything like it in Pennsylvania. The classic bank barns that we associate with this part of the woods, you find all over the place, and we're in the bank barn portion, or the 19th century portion of the farm. So it's 18th century, 19th century, which is very unusual. Much of the original flooring is here as well. And so could you give us a feel for what you think was transpiring in this building after the battle?
Yeah, I almost hate to characterize that, Pete, because it has to be indescribable to what these soldiers would have experienced in July of 1863. Barksdale's Mississippians will be treated here, as well as some other Confederates from Semmes and Wofford's brigades. We have Mississippi and Georgia soldiers here. And they're here for days and weeks after the battle in stifling July heat with the rains that will begin on July the 4th. And some of them will perish here. Estimate maybe 40, in the low 40s, Confederate soldiers will die here at the Crawford farm and be buried on the outside in some of these unmarked graves.
And so, Jen, I'm not speaking about this site specifically, but in general. When the Confederates retreated and they had to leave their wounded here and they fell into the hands of the Union Army as POWs, do you have any sense, and again, I'm speaking generally here, how they were treated by Union authorities? What kind of medical care did they receive? And so is it possible to give us some insights into that?
Yeah, the Union Army will be fair, I would say, to treating the Confederates. Of course, the Union Army doesn't begin to pursue in full force until July the 7th, so they will take care of thousands of Confederate wounded. The Battle of Gettysburg brings 51,000 casualties, and about 23 or 25,000 of them are wounded, which is enormous. Whenever I teach Civil War, I always tell my students, and I'm at Oklahoma State, our football stadium sits about 58,000 people. So if you can imagine sitting in a professional baseball stadium, that's the casualties of the Battle at Gettysburg. That's a tremendous amount of men that need to be buried and cared for. And of course, Camp Letterman, which is on the east side of town, will care for so many of these wounded soldiers until November. When Lincoln is here, they are still taking care of the wounded from the Battle of Gettysburg.
I should know this, but I don't. Were there Confederates transferred to Letterman as well? Or does that, I mean, I know Federals are at Camp Letterman, but were there any Confederates there? I don't know.
I don't know. I'm not 100% sure of the answer on that.
I'm not sure if that was the case.
We will find out on the Q&A.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that.
We'll find out about
The
that.
Camp Letterman is months after the battle, serving the wounded.
One of the things I'd like for you to reflect upon, you mentioned the extraordinary casualty rate for Barksdale's brigade. You're more than 50%.
Yeah.
And when we think about Gettysburg and we try to situate it within the progression of the war, Ashley and I have had conversations about, and others, about how do we think about Gettysburg as a turning point, or is that even very useful to think of it as a turning point? So if we step back from that question of turning point, right, and we think about the impact of Gettysburg on Lee's army and the future of Lee's army and its capacity to be an offensive fighting force as it had demonstrated itself to be, from 1862 onward. How do you think, again, about what Gettysburg did to Lee's army, and how should we situate this battle within our understanding of the war for Lee's army as well as for the war in Virginia?
Well, from the Confederate perspective, this is a strategic defeat, right? They don't achieve any of their objectives to influence the war in any significant way. I'm always struck by Kent Masterson Brown's argument in Retreat from Gettysburg, where he claims about the success they had in foraging, that they gained so much food from this campaign, and it's inconceivable to think thousands of hogs and cattle that they're shuffling back down to the Potomac River, get them across the Potomac on July the 14th, and they feed their army through the fall of 1863. That's incredible.
Yeah, it is. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of that forage did make it across the Potomac. I mean, Lee's army in August and early September is in a logistical crisis, and desertion is at an all-time high. So there's a real breakdown after this battle. And I mentioned before that idea that Lee had unfounded or too much confidence, I should say, in his men. That it's never really made a lot of sense to me. What makes sense to me is that after the battle, he had too much confidence and faith in his men to overcome the impossible. I mean, that logistical breakdown put his men, to the breaking point, and he continued to expect that those men could rise above that privation and that suffering. And he thought that their devotion and character on an individual level, that it should be strong enough and that they should have the resolve to keep persevering. I think that's where his expectations were unrealistic. But it seems to me that prior to this campaign, during this campaign, in the midst of the battle, I think his trust was probably well placed.
Well, and imagine the impact for the Union soldiers, the Army of the Potomac, who's never before beaten R.E. Lee, and they do here in Pennsylvania with a new commander, George Meade, only in command for 3 days. And that's why the headlines of the Philadelphia Inquirer reads Waterloo Eclipse. For them, this is a huge victory that boosts their very much sagging and much needed morale and sustains them in the days to come.
Well, standing here is a poignant reminder of how the war inseparable from the civilian experience. I mean, I'm old enough to say that when I started studying Civil War history, that the civilian experience and the military experience, they were in their own silos. Right. And now it's unthinkable that we would discuss any battle without finding the ways that it connected and touched, had an impact on the civilian world. So that discussion about Gettysburg's impact on civilians here in Adams County, we're going to continue that later with Ashley Lusky. But I just want to remind everybody that if you have questions for Jen, we're going to have a live question and answer period here so people can write in their questions or comments, and you'll be happy to answer them as well. And then finally, I want to just say that really going to appreciate Jen, who has been a stalwart for CWI. She is one, again, those few academics who can do the battlefield tour, but you can also give an outstanding presentation. We're all very excited for your book on George Gordon Meade. And what Jen has done for us and our other speakers is that they bring in our folks here, and it's that community that is absolutely at the core of what we do at CWI. And it helps us then to reach out to younger Civil War historians. But Jen, I'm going to tell you that none of this would be possible at all if it weren't for my good friend and my predecessor, Gabor Bor. So for those of you who don't know Gabor Bor, Gabor was the founder of the Civil War Institute, and he has been just a wonderful mentor and friend to me. Even before I got the job here, I was teaching down in North Carolina, and Gabor gave me a call. He said, I see you're going to be up in Gettysburg. I'd like for you to come and meet my students. I want to underscore that point, that Gabor cared deeply about teaching here at Gettysburg College. He cared a great deal about the students.
Commemorate the Battle of Gettysburg. Each day includes battle walks with park rangers and certified battlefield guides, illustrating the moments in time that shaped the fighting each day. The anniversary continues July 4th with the Confederation of Union Generals portraying historical figures of the time. PCM's Gettysburg Anniversary Programming, July 1st through the 4th.
All right. Pete, I think you are still muted. Jen.
We're good?
You're good.
There we
Okay.
go. Now I'm
There
back.
you
All right, Jen, I think the first question, which I won't ask you about Eudora Welty now. I don't suspect that you ran out and got, look at her dismissive look and got Optimus Daughter, which is a great novel. But I will ask you, what did you find out about Camp Letterman and wounded Confederate prisoners?
Pete, I'm glad you asked that. And you know that I go to no lengths to find out detail and research for you and all of our CWI attendees.
Right.
And I have the answer. There were over 6,000 Confederates treated at Camp Letterman.
Wow.
Over 6,000 wounded Confederates treated at Camp Letterman.
And after they were treated, they of course were dispersed to various prisons. What prisons, if you have to of course rank them, you don't need to do that, but what were the likely destinations for these Confederate wounded soldiers?
Probably up into New York and Ohio, right?
Well, I don't know. I'm asking you. Certainly Elmira would have been a
Yeah,
place.
Elmira.
I don't know. I don't know about Point Lookout. I mean, they're obviously taking Confederate officers to Johnson's Island. They're sending them there. So, but I think they probably scattered them. But I don't know the likely destination for the enlisted men. And maybe there wasn't just one place, and maybe there wasn't one place that got a preponderance of them. I'm not sure. But that's really interesting to know. The Camp Letterman site is, I should note, is somewhat endangered by some development that is creeping in that area. Creeping is probably not the right word. It is racing into that area. So I know there's some folks out there that are trying to preserve some of the land out there, and I hope that they will be successful in their bid. So we now have an opportunity here for questions from the audience, and of course Ashley is the master of that. So what do you have for Jen?
So the first question that has come in is from Lee Elder, talking about just the enormous swath of distance that this battle covers, and talking about why it was so costly and why it was so difficult. I think it's hard for us to imagine these days just how enormous these battle lines are. Jen, you already mentioned the strength of the position of the Peach Orchard and that it was really good ground. And so this question concerns the difficulties of communicating along these huge battle lines. I guess first, could you explain how exactly does that communication occur? And second of all, could that have resulted also in kind of the breakdown and some of the huge cost that came out of this particular assault?
Yeah, that's a smart question. And, you know, Gettysburg is a battlefield that's intact, and we're sort of privileged to be able to see the ground there. But you mentioned about like the size of it. I led some students to a World War I battlefield study abroad a few years ago, and those battlefields far eclipse the size of a Civil War battlefield. And you have the same kind of questions of command and communication in 1917. And really things haven't improved a terrible amount. But for the privates, the soldiers in Barksdale's command, the men in his brigade, their orders are really simple. We know how Civil War frontal assaults work. You file in and you're told to follow the flag, right? You're in this linear formation, moving forward in this massive humanity. Barksdale, of course, is, we mentioned in the talk, is approaching and commanding on horseback. So that's not uncommon. A lot of Civil War soldiers would do that. It would allow them to see their men and exercise unit cohesion, and similarly be seen by their men. Makes them a tough target at times as well. But the same problem is true for the Union line. And you all know I'm deep in the George Meade research right now, but Meade exercises command on July the 2nd. He is everywhere on the Union battle line on July the 2nd to help forestall the success these Confederates are having. And Meade will personally be leading units in to fill gaps, pivotal gaps on the Union line by the success the Confederates are having near 7:30 in the evening. So command and control is certainly problematic in any Civil War battle, not just Gettysburg.
Sure. And of course, when you're talking about the fog of war too, you know, you're told to follow a flag, but as soon as the first few cannon go off, the smoke can obliterate that flag from vision, and same with following an officer. So yeah, the range of vision, I'm sure, is also a huge factor here, and that you're told to follow one visual cue and then that up and disappears pretty quickly.
Ashley, I just want another quick question for Jen about tactics. So there's been a great deal written about the nature of combat in the Civil War. And the prevailing argument now, really advanced by Earl Hess, but others have made it, like Patty Griffin, that Civil War combat, small arms combat, that it often took place in less than 100 yards, more like 50 to 75 yards. Does your reading of Gettysburg, because Jen, you know the battle so well, do you feel comfortable with these kinds of generalizations? Is it something that we should hold on to help people understand the nature of warfare, or are they actually creating distortions?
No, I think that's true. And that's been one of the big questions in Civil War historiography is how effective the rifle was in the mini ball. Does it modernize warfare? I read on that quite a bit back as a master's degree student. And I think that Earl Hess and his argument is spot on. And Brent Nosworthy makes a similar argument to that, and Edward Hegerman. So really the professional historians are coalescing around that and suggesting that the rifle and the mini ball didn't significantly, although it has longer firing range, right, 300 yards now, it doesn't significantly change the nature of Civil War combat. And you see that on Pickett's charge on July the 3rd. When you look at how close those Confederates and Union soldiers at the angle are fighting, they're well within 100 yards or less. That's fierce hand-to-hand combat that you see. And that exemplifies so many of these fights. Little Round Top would be the same. I mean, this is a ghastly slugfest in these Civil War battlefields.
Just interesting to hold on to that point in for tomorrow, because Scott Hartwig has his opinion based upon his reading of Antietam, and it's a little bit different. So, which is great. That's what we want to see. So, if Scott addresses that same issue tomorrow, everyone will hear it tomorrow when we were at Antietam.
So a question about the salient. Because of the short number of troops that Sickles had to fill that large amount of ground that he is now expected to cover with the Third Corps, the position of the salient, did he actually have 4 flanks that were up in the air, or was it really 2 because the portions were close together at the apex?
Yeah, so the salient at the Peach Orchard is the two flanks. You have Barksdale's men coming from the west, and then some of men from Kershaw and the South Carolinians coming from the south. But in the entirety of Sickles' line, he has other flanks, right? You have to worry about Devil's Den now in that position, and then you have to worry about your northern or your right flank up around the Kadori farm. And the Confederates have success on all of those fronts. The Georgians will capture and hold Devil's Den, and they'll achieve a breakthrough further up the Union line on the northern front of it after 7:30, after Barksdale's assault. So this is an incredibly vulnerable position. And I mentioned the artillery in one of our stops about Freeman McGilvery. And some of you might know I'm a big fan of the 9th Massachusetts and John Bigelow. And if you study July the 2nd and Sickles' line, I mean, the artillery is really in a precarious position on Sickles' line, and John Bigelow and the 9th Mass is one of the kind of the heroes of the Union line. He's 23 years old, Bigelow is, and he's told to sacrifice his battery for about 20 to 30 minutes until the line behind him, that low ground swale, can be reinforced with Union soldiers. And he does. And this is the 9th Massachusetts baptism of fire. They were raised and mustered in 1862 earlier, but they had not yet seen combat. So the first time these guys see combat is on July the 2nd in the Peach Orchard, the hottest place to be in for your baptism of fire. Bigelow's going to be wounded twice. About 50% of his command will be wounded near the Trossel farm in that sacrificial stand. And 4 of their 6 guns will be captured. Then some Union soldiers will recapture them, but that really underscores, and kind of back to Pete's question about Civil War tactics, your thin line that Sickles has makes your infantry vulnerable, but it really makes your artillery vulnerable. And men like Bigelow in the 9th Mass will pay the fruits of that.
Jen, I know it's always dangerous to play counterfactuals, especially when it comes to military history. But a big what if question that a lot of people have, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is if things had stepped off earlier in the day, if Longstreet had sent Barksdale earlier in the day, do you think that he would have had even more success over the course of the entire attack?
I think it would depend on how early, right? Because Longstreet gets in trouble with the countermarch, and that delays the whole event on July the 2nd. Sickles' forward movement starts at about 1 o'clock, and his men in position about 3 o'clock. So that takes about 2 hours. So if we're talking, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., you have a different fight on July the 2nd than what we get by 3 o'clock when the Third Corps is in position, and then by 4 o'clock by the time the Confederate assault steps off. But, we study Civil War history and we know the outcome. We're all well read. We know what happens 160 years ago, but nothing is determined on July 2nd at 6 o'clock. Right? The fate of the battle and these two armies hang in a precarious position. And so many decisions and so many small and big decisions really change the outcome of this battle.
Right. And that's what we were talking about last night too, with Carol Reardon's book on Pickett's Charge, is the importance of contingency, that none of this is inevitable at any point in time. That even, the fact that Longstreet being late to the field, or being into position late, I should say, didn't necessarily mean this was bound to failure. You're right that so many different decisions are happening and unfolding on the battlefield, and that's how people respond to those in the moment on an individual scale, but also on a collective scale that helps shape the outcome of what happens.
Yeah, it's all Sickles' fault, really. The whole Battle of Gettysburg rests on Dan Sickles' shoulders on July the 2nd.
I hope we don't have any descendants amongst us.
But Jen, don't you think that, we focus on Longstreet and the delays, and if he had only attacked earlier, but if he had attacked earlier, where it probably would have had its greatest impact would have been on the Union right flank. I mean, can you imagine if Johnson's division had actual daylight to fight in? They were up against a brigade, a little more than a brigade. So the question of more time, actually, Longstreet would have given Johnson more time, and because of Meade's, what I would say, overreaction, and that's easy for me to say, of course, to the crisis on the Union left flank. It's pretty easy to imagine the Confederates at the very least getting to the Baltimore Turnpike. And that would, of course, I think, made a little difficult for Meade to maintain his position there. So I think it's always interesting to focus about what Longstreet's impact is, the delays that impact for the Confederate left flank, which we don't often think about.
Right. I mean, those attacks were to be simultaneous, right? They were to be coordinated, with Ewell attacking Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill to prevent Meade from reinforcing, which is exactly what he does. But Meade is incredibly concerned about the Union right. Early in the morning, he sends out thoughts to attack from his flank. He sends out Slocum and Warren to do a reconnaissance. So that's the part of his line that he's fixated on. And as a consequence, and maybe a fair criticism of Meade, it's the left flank, and Sickles particularly, that is going to cause him the biggest trouble of the entire battle.
So the split that occurs, Jen, where the 21st Mississippi breaks off, what is the cause of that split? And Barksdale follows the 21st, right? That's who he ends up going with. So what is the cause?
I've never seen any evidence, and if anyone has, I'd be happy to hear, maybe you could orient me to it, that was deliberate. I don't have any reason to believe that it was. I think it's just the nature of hitting the salient, the command, and the confusion that far right regiment, which was down by the observation tower when we laid them out, the Longstreet Tower, the 21st, ends up moving down Plum Run. They get to the Emmitsburg Road, the other three peel north, and they hit the Union regiments like a line of dominoes right up towards the Kadori farm. And then it's the 21st Mississippi that drives down through towards Plum Run and really achieves the biggest breakthrough on July the 2nd, combined with Kershaw and some of the other men, and then Wofford further north on the line.
Okay. There's another interesting question about Gettysburg as a turning point, which I know we often are very wary about using that term to say that this was, the turning point, and after this point in the war, everything went downhill for the Confederates and everything went uphill for the Union. But it might have been a turning point, certainly one of many. Is it fair to say that Gettysburg was perhaps a turning point because of the sheer loss of Confederate officers in the Army of Northern Virginia?
Right. So the combined casualties of the battles we know is 51,000. So if you break them down, Lee loses about 28,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. And his losses in the officer corps, particularly the kind of the middle rank of the officers, are tremendous. If you think about the assault on July the 3rd, really at the brigade level with Pickett's charge, Pickett's division with Kemper, Garnett, and Armistead, all three of those commanders are wounded on July the 3rd. So it's that middle echelon of the officer corps of the Army of Northern Virginia that suffers very heavily. And by 1863, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate government do not have that kind of talent or man pool to draw from, which makes it incredibly difficult to replace those talented, skilled, junior, upper tiered officers in the Confederate Army.
Sure.
The same's true though for Meade. I'm always going to come back to Meade now, folks. So just kind of get ready to accept this for the next 2 years. But Meade writes after the battle during the pursuit, grumbling or lamenting the loss of officers. John Reynolds, of course, falls mortally wounded. Hancock is wounded as well, and he really misses those trusted subordinates. And it has no doubt an impact on unit cohesion and strategic and operational planning for weeks and months to come.
Right. Yeah, I think that's always, again, hindsight, armchair general, as we think of, oh, look at how badly Lee's army was whipped and look at how bloodied it was. But then we forget about all of the enormous losses on the Union side too. And that's one of the reasons, as we talked again last night with Carol Reardon, why even after Pickett's charge, yes, Union troops were relieved and feeling triumphant in many ways after the close of the battle, but they also were overwhelmed by the grief, which clouded some of those feelings of victory and triumph. And the Confederates knew they had done a pretty good number on Meade's army as well. So that could have been definitely another reason why maybe they were not so convinced that they had been completely annihilated for the rest of the war. Like I think a lot of people like to think of that after Gettysburg, Confederate morale just tanked and, soldiers thought that there was no other way for them to win.
Yeah. And the soldiers are reflecting on that. I was like one soldier's quote about Sickles being wounded, and he writes about his leg being amputated and says, whatever the loss of Sickles' leg was to him, it was no great loss to us. So they were happy that Sickles was discharged from the Third Corps, right? So they're tuned into these questions too, with really important stakes and consequences.
Sure. We have a question. History tells us that Antietam represents the highest level of casualties in a single day in U.S. history. We do not have statistics for each day of Gettysburg. Some have said that if we did, the second day might well be worse than Antietam. Comment?
Right. So the second day alone is over 20,000 of the 51,000 casualties. And the second day alone represents one of the top 10 bloodiest days of the Civil War. Right. So taken as a whole, it's July the 2nd that really is the bloodletting of the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah.
May 3rd at Chancellorsville would be right up there, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, May 3rd
Is it
would
top
be
10 bloodiest day?
Yeah, absolutely. It would have to be top 5, I would think.
Yeah. Pete had mentioned your career, Jen, which might be a good way to close this session, unless you have final thoughts about working as an academic as well as in public history, giving tours in the battlefield, being a military historian. And a comment that came in, or a question that came in, was that a lot of the young women historians that have graduated under this individual who submitted the comment have gone on to do social and cultural history, not necessarily traditional military history. Could you maybe comment on what directed you in that position and what kind of the pool of other young military historians who are females is like these days, kind of what the direction that you've seen things go in your career?
So for me, I interned at Gettysburg as an undergrad between my junior and senior year of college. And then I ended up working for the National Park Service for 9 summers. And for me, it was the opportunity to be on the battlefield and talk with people like you, thousands of people from around the country, millions from around the globe about the Civil War. And there's no substitute for being on the landscape. There's nothing as special or no greater way to talk about the Civil War and its importance and its consequence than standing on those grounds. So for me, it just stuck. And I ended up then studying Civil War and US military history through my PhD. And that's what I teach at Oklahoma State. I get to teach all the best classes. I teach all the classes about war. But there are many good quality female Civil War military academics. Leslie Gordon, Carol Reardon, who we sort of paid tribute to last night, Susanna Ural. You know, there's a collection of us that when we do write something, it's top shelf quality work. And hopefully more people will be doing that kind of work, more women will be doing the kind of work that I am, and we can shift the field in that important direction. But at the end of the day, y'all, I hope you respect my research as a scholar, not as a female Civil War scholar.
Good. Pete, did you have any closing comments?
No, I'm looking forward to partnering with Jen this time next year on the 18th Virginia. I'm sure there'll be lots of back and forth. And I'm sure we're going to meet at the Reliance Mine Saloon. That's my new favorite watering hole.
Good.
Yeah,
I've been going there a long time. Yeah.
It's very, it's got character, as they say.
Indeed.
All right, Jen, thank you so much. We so appreciate it. And so we have a little bit of a break here. And then at 3:15, we'll start our final program for the day. It'll be Ashley at the Rose Farm and then at the Gadori House. And we had Heather was our camera person there, but we're doing PCN for this, are we not?
Yes,
We are doing that as well.
PCN.
Well, that's great. All right, you all. So we'll see you back here in just a short, what time is it even? It is almost 3.
Almost 20 minutes.
So we got a little bit, almost 20 minutes as well. All right, again, thank you so much, Jen, and we'll see you all in about 20 minutes.
You bet. Thanks for having me, y'all. Bye, y'all.
Take care.